Hey guys, welcome back. We are going to be talking today about how to write captions. This is one of our most commonly asked questions because it's an area of student publication creation that people struggle with the most. Usually people love to take pictures, they love designing things, designing the spread, but when it comes to writing captions, that's usually where our weakest area is because it's really hard to make a unique caption for every single photo. You don't know what to say, you don't know those people, you don't know the details, and so it's really hard to create a caption that not only explains that to the reader, tells who's in the photo, but also is interesting and engaging to read. And so in this video, we're going to go over this PDF guide that you see in front of you. So be sure to head to our website. The link is in the description box below, and you can download this PDF and follow along with me. Okay, so to get started, we're going to talk about the types of captions. Here, I've broken them down into 3 different types: a standard, a basic, and an identification or an ident. But just so you know, this is not an exact science. However your publication decides that they want to do captions, that is totally fine as long as it's consistent. So if you don't follow this exact formula, that's okay, but this is a really easy way to learn the basics, and then if you guys want to switch up your structure a little bit and include more or less detail based on your staff, their capabilities, the bandwidth you have available, that sort of stuff, that's totally fine. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to break it down into these 3 categories. So the first one is your standard caption. This identifies who is in the photo, what is happening in the photo. It might include additional details or it'll include a quote. And so you can see an example here. It's a pretty long caption. So it has a mini headline that's also referred to as a lead-in or a subhead or a caption headline, or there's a bunch of different names you can use for it. It has what I call a directive, which is telling the reader where this caption is going, to what photo. So it's above, below, whatever. And then it has your caption. It's usually 2 or 3 sentences, and it's robust. It tells the reader exactly who's in the photo, what grade level they're in, what position they're in, what the event is that they're doing, what candid action is happening in the photo. And then it might include additional details that are helpful to the reader to know what was contextually happening at that time. And it could include a quote from someone that you interviewed about that moment. As well as, any additional information that they might have that you can't see just by looking in the photo. So this is the goal, right? We want all of our photos in our yearbook, every single one, to have a standard caption. That is what we strive for. But I realize that sometimes you don't have space. Sometimes you don't have the bandwidth. You have brand new staff members that have never written anything related to student publications. And there's just not, that is a goal we'll set for the future, but we're not there yet, right? So in that case, I would encourage you, for every single caption that you have, for every single photo in the book, you have a basic caption. It needs to identify who is in the photo and what is happening. So this is something like preparing to serve next, first name, last name, stretches in between sets. It says who's in the photo, who's pictured, and it also gives you some context as to what's happening. You still might have had to interview that person. You had to be paying attention when you took those pictures. You still are adding context, so it's probably a tennis or volleyball picture. There's more information than just their first and last name, but that is the basic for every single photo that is in the book. And I know that it's daunting to think about writing a caption, at least a sentence at minimum for every single photo in the book, but that is really what we should be doing in order to add context to our yearbooks and not just have scrapbooks of pages with beautiful pictures, but really add that historical documentation element that is what a yearbook is. And then our last option is what I call an ident or an identification. And that is literally just the name and grade and who's in the photo. This is like worst case scenario, last minute. But notice we don't leave this out. It is really important that every single person that's pictured in the book is identified because our memories are not perfect. And when you look back at this book 10, 20, even in May when it comes out or the end of the year or whatever, you're not going to remember everybody in that book. You don't know everyone in that book. And so it's really important that we identify that, not just now, but for the future as well. But also that gives you the ability to index them. And so they can look in the back and see what pages they're on. That is one of students' most favorite parts of getting the yearbook is what page am I on, whatever. And so if you aren't indexing, it's super easy to add one and it doesn't take up a lot of space. It's also an additional area for you to add some content in there that didn't really fit anywhere else. I highly recommend that you have an index if you don't already, and making sure that you name everybody on those pages accurately is important, but making sure that everyone is identified. I like to save this one for like a sidebar where it's limited space, but we want to make sure we identify them, or we're kind of filling in space with something artistic, but there's people featured, headshots, that kind of thing. But if you can, you want to strive to at least do a basic caption on every photo. And don't get into the habit of allowing yourself to just do an identification and saying, well, it's good enough, at least they're identified for the index. No, we really want to add that context and add that detail into our book. So then we're going to talk about the anatomy of a caption. So those are the basic types, but now let's break down what that standard one, what are the different parts of it. So the first part is the headline. So like I said, it's referred to as several different things. It could be referred to as the mini headline, the sub headline, the caption headline, the lead in, the lead, the action. There's lots of different terms for this. But it's basically just an engaging phrase that's intended to draw on the reader. It relates to the photo. It might relate to the theme if you can. That'd be awesome. It might be punny or funny. It might be a little common phrase or a joke. Like it can be something that's just meant to get the attention of the reader, because the real juicy information is in the caption. So this is just something to draw them in. It's also really great because you get to incorporate another theme element. So make it a different font, make it bold, make it a color, and draw attention to it. It can really enhance your spread and make it look more vibrant because you have that extra little bit that you're able to design. Then we have a directive. And so this is what tells the reader what photo this caption is referring to. So it might say left or far left or above, below, far below, middle. It's telling the reader in correlation to where this caption is placed, what photo is it referring to. It's really important that your captions stay on the same side of the spread, on the same page as your photos, so that makes it easier. So you're not saying far left and it means on the other page. And if a picture goes across the gutter, it needs to stay on whatever more of the photo is on. There's sometimes an exception because sometimes you're designing and it just doesn't happen that way, but the most of the time, the rule, and we learn the rules and then we can break the rules, the rule is that your captions need to stay on the same side of the page as the photo. And so when it says above, it's going to be very clear that there's not very much question as to where that caption's photo is. I'm going to move myself over here. Then we have our first sentence, and arguably the most important sentence. This is also what that basic caption is referring to, is this first sentence. You just don't continue after with part 4. And so this sentence is always written in present tense. That's super, super important because it changes in part 4. So make sure you note that this is written in present tense. So this is where we're going to identify who's in the photo and explain what is happening. So if this photo has more than 5 people, like JV cheerleaders, you can group them and refer to them as JV cheerleaders because there's somewhere else in the book where they can see who exactly in their group photo is a JV cheerleader. But for this instance, you're going to refer to them as a group because you don't have to name all 12 cheerleaders in your caption. But if it's 5 people or less, you want to name every single one and make sure that they are identified with their name and their grade level. Also, it is really important that as a staff, when you're determining your style guide, you decide how are you going to notate grade levels. There's lots of different ways to do it. You can do it by parentheses, you can do it by their grade level, like 9, 10, 11, 12, or their graduation year, 21, 22, 23, 24. You can also refer to them by their classification if you're in high school, like freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, or you can do it as a superscript. There's lots of different ways. The most important thing, like I said, is consistency. So just decide on which one you like best, either for aesthetics or for whatever reason, and go with that. The one note I'll say about this, and this is more my preference than anything, when I'm looking at a book and it's not a school that I'm familiar with, right, I'm looking and I'm seeing someone's grade level and it says 24. I have to look at the year that yearbook was made, do the math, what grade level are they in, if I'm trying to figure out, if I was looking at this book 50 years from now, what grade level was I in? So I don't think that using the graduation year is as helpful to the reader. But I understand it if your theme is related to that. If your theme is related to something about the graduation year, it makes sense. It's just not as user-friendly as using the actual grade level like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So just something to think about, but that's also my personal preference. Okay, so moving on to part 4. I need to move myself again. This is where you're going to add subsequent sentences. So notice there's no rule on how many sentences. I would say at least 1. But sometimes you have a really good story that goes along with your picture and there is more detail behind there that you need to add into the caption to add context or make it make sense or add additional details that are just really interesting and engaging. And so don't feel limited by 3-sentence captions or 2-sentence captions. Do what you have to do to tell the story. The most important thing we're talking about is consistency and telling that story. Don't write a caption and force yourself to put words on the paper just because you were told to write a caption. Really look at that photo and say, what is the important information about this moment, about this story that I need to tell the reader? Why am I picking this picture for my spread? If you don't have the answer to that, maybe it's not a great picture. Maybe you're just picking it because it looks good, but it doesn't actually have the best story. And so that would bring me back to go and look at why did I pick that picture, and maybe I need to pick a different one. But in this instance, you've already identified who's in the photo and explained what is happening on a basic level. And now we're going to go and add additional details. So this can be in the form of just additional sentences, background information that the reader would know just by looking at the photo. But it can also include that and a direct quote from a source. So that means you go to the person in the picture, you interview them about whatever that it is they were doing in that picture, and you pull another 1 or 2 sentences from their experience and they share that sentiment. So you don't necessarily need both an additional sentence and a quote. Sometimes it's one or the other. Sometimes it is both. Either one is totally fine. Again, as long as you have allotted an adequate amount of space for your captions, you should be good to go. All right, so now I have a few quick notes about quotes. So there are a lot of rules when it comes to quotes. They get messed up all the time because they're very particular. So I'm going to go through each one. So the first is that the content in your quote should be engaging. And that is a very generic term. We always talk about engagement. We want all of our student body to be engaged so we get good pictures. We want our social media content to be engaging so they will like it and subscribe, whatever. And so that's important for this too. If you are struggling to get a caption quote that is good, you're probably asking lame questions. And I don't mean to put the blame on you, but the reality is if you're getting crappy answers, you're probably asking crappy questions. So you want to think about what would be a great quote for this caption. Is it, yeah, I really love basketball because we worked really hard as a team and pulled through in the end. No, like that quote can be used from anybody on any sports team, any year, in any school. It does not matter. And it's not really saying anything. So you want to ask questions that are very specific and you get players or whoever's in that photo to react to something. So they're reacting to how they felt or they're explaining how they felt, and it's something that is a emotional appeal. So if it's something that's factual or it's information that you could get by Googling or looking at the schedule, things like who you played, who the opponent was, that's not quote worthy. That can go in that additional sentence information transitioning into your quote, and then they can talk about how they were really scared to go against that opponent. That sort of stuff is great. But we don't want to lean on these really crappy quotes we got from interviews that we were forced to do. Like, that also doesn't tell that story. And so we want to make sure that we're being really selective with the quotes that we use and making sure that they're furthering that story and really bringing the reader into their experience. Okay, another really important thing is that all quotes need to be verbatim, and that means word for word what the source said. So, one, you need to keep track of these interviews. So you need to record them or have them in screenshots, saved into a Google Drive folder or somewhere that if it comes up, and I'm telling you this because it's happened to me, and it's happened to many others, if it comes up that some student says, I never said that, and that's in the yearbook, it's so common. You have the receipts. You can be like, well, sorry, Johnny, you said it right here. Here's your screenshot. And they're like, oh, crap. But if you haven't taken that quote verbatim, if you've changed it, then they didn't say that. And so context can be changed so easily. It's already hard enough to read context through text. So it's really important that you keep records of that, but also you quote them verbatim. The only things that I say you can remove are things like I say so much. I'm sure you've noticed in my video already. You can edit that out. I just did it. But you don't want to edit anything else out. So contextually, you want to leave it the exact way they said it, except for things like slang and transitional words, stutters. Obviously, don't put that kind of stuff in there, but the context of what they're saying needs to be verbatim. Next, one of the most obvious things is that quotes need to be in quotation marks. This is something that we learned in, I don't know, second grade, third grade, elementary school for sure. And you surround a quote with quotation marks. This is what indicates to the reader that someone said this. This isn't the writer. This isn't anything that was this isn't anything that was assumed or implied. This was verbatim a quote from a source. And so you want to make sure you have a quote mark at the front and at the end of every single quote that you have on your page. Then, again, we learned this in elementary school, but it gets mistaken a lot, is that the quote ends with a comma, not a period, and that comma goes inside the quotation marks. So when I'm grading my students' papers, I don't even fix it. This is something that I expect them to know, and I just write QF for quote format. If that comma is outside the quote or that comma is a period, there's quote marks missing, whatever kind of formatting issues, I put it back on them to go fix it before I even look at the rest of it, because if they missed it on one, they probably missed it on others. So that's one of the most common mistakes we see in caption writing, but it's one of the easiest to fix. So before you turn your spread into your editor or your advisor, make sure that you have those commas, not periods, inside those quote marks on both sides, and then that the quote is attributed. So talking about attributions, it's really important that every single person who's been quoted accurately and verbatim, it also says who said it. So yes, you've identified who's in that photo, but you might have identified 3 people in that photo. So how are we supposed to know who said that quote? Obviously, the 3 of them didn't say it in unison, so you need to attribute who said that quote. So at the end of the comma and then the quote mark, you say their first name, last name, said. But you've already referred to them for the first time in the first part of the caption. So on the second reference or third or fourth, you just need to use their last name. The only exception being if you have twins or you have people that have the same last name, or you have like a mom and a daughter that both work at the same school, they have the same last name, then you need to clarify who said it. But typically you've already referred to them in the first sentence, and so you can just use their last name afterward. Then after their name, you're going to put the word said, period. It's always said. It's never exclaimed or yelled or shouted or whispered ever. It is only said. And that is what journalistically preserves the integrity of their sentiment. So the reader can infer what they're meaning with their words, and the journalist is not putting that sentiment onto their words. So it's always just first name, last name, said. Or since you referred to them already, last name, said, period. And that is it. And then you move on. Now, one more quick note is if your caption has a quote that is more than one sentence, which most captions, if you have a quote, it's going to be one sentence. But just in case, that attribution goes after the first sentence, and then the second sentence does end with a period because you've already attributed it. So just so you know, if it's longer than one sentence, that attribution, the first name, last name, said, goes after the first, and then you continue on with your quote and end that last one with a period. Okay, so we've talked a lot about what goes in a caption, all this information you need. You're going to have to be interviewing people, talking to people, getting this information, right? How do you even begin to organize all the information that you need to have? Well, I have a really easy formula for you, and it's just as easy as ABCD. So the first thing you want to consider when you're gathering your caption information is A, for action lead-in. So this is that mini headline, that subhead. Remember I told you it could be called action lead-in. So this is like what's going to lead them into the caption, capture their attention. This could also be A for attention getter, but it's just that engaging phrase that's intended to draw someone in. And so this could be you going in with a thesaurus and looking at different words that are triggered from things that are happening in the photo or the background that you know about the scenario that's going on. Any of that could lead to whatever that action lead-in is. I'm a big fan of making them related to your theme if you can. Obviously, that's always our goal. Or making them funny, because that's going to be something that draws your reader in, but always making sure that they're school appropriate, obviously. Then we go into B for basic information. This is Journalism 101. It's the information that you need for the first sentence, who's in the photo and what's happening. You can also gain other information, the 5 W's and the H, the who, what, when, where, why, and how, another thing we've learned since elementary school, and you can use that in there as well to describe what's happening in the photo. Then we move on to complementary information. So this is that additional section. So this might be the background information. This might be additional details you can't tell from looking at the photo. Something that the reader would know unless they were at the event. Something that the school community knows, but the world doesn't. That sort of stuff would all be under complementary information. You might not even use all of it, but it's important to gather because as you're listing out all of this complementary information, something might stand out at you, be like, oh my gosh, I really do need to mention that. Like that was a fundraiser for this, and it was because of someone's child, and there's a backstory. It's not just a random event. So you want to make sure you can gather as much complementary information as you can. And then, like we talked about, our direct quote. So this might be from an interview from a source, but it also might be like someone that's not in the photo. Like it might be somebody like the principal who organized this event and it's a group photo. So you don't really have someone pictured and quoted directly, but you have like a person of interest quoted. That also works. And so, but typically we want our sources to be in the photos. And that's it. Once you've done A, B, C, and D, you have all the information you need to be able to write a really great caption. So let's try it together. We have an example. In your packet, there is a photo, and we have given you the who, what, when, where, why, and how. So we've given you all these details for this photo right here. You can make some assumptions looking at the photo, what's happening, right? Obviously, girl getting her head shaved, there's another person doing it, and there's some people in the background. That's pretty much all we know, right? So let's look at the details that they've given us. First is the who. Left is Samantha Smith. You can't really see anything but her arm, but that's her name. The right is Mila Moreno. They're both seniors, and that's who's in the photo. Then we have the what. Students got their heads shaved to raise money for cancer research. Cool. Then it happened on October 12th, where competition gym. Why the philanthropy event was hosted by student council because the sponsor's daughter has cancer. And then how was the event hosted? It was a buyout pep rally. Then we also have a direct quote here. So it says, even though I didn't trust Samantha with an electric razor, it was worth it because I raised a bunch of money for cancer research, Mila said. That meant a lot to me because my grandpa passed away from lung cancer recently. Great quote, super interesting, kind of funny in the beginning, and then pulled on your heartstrings with a personal story why this event was interesting to her. It's also really important to note that the caption didn't just end with that first sentence. There was that second sentence that you wouldn't have got unless you kept talking to Mila about this experience. And she gave you additional details that were really interesting and engaging for the reader that you wouldn't have got if you just stopped at, I didn't trust Samantha with an electric razor, but I raised a lot of money. Still a good caption quote, still interesting and still worthy of being quoted, but not nearly as good as it on its own as it is with that second sentence. So back to your packet, you have two worksheets. You have step 1 and step 2. Step 1 is where you're going to do the ABCD and you're going to gather all your content. A lot of it is on that page I just showed you, but you're going to write it down in your own words and start thinking about the basic information and formulating that information, those bullet points, into sentences. The action lead-in, I would encourage you to use a thesaurus and make a list of like 8 or 10 or 15 ideas that you could possibly use for it, and then pick your favorite. And then the direct quote, you don't have to rewrite because it's on that page, but in the future, you could use this space to write down your direct quote for your own caption. Then in step 2, you're going to actually write your caption. So you'll decide what's your headline and your directive you could throw in there, and then your first sentence, and then your additional sentences or your quote. So last, let's look at an example of this photo's captions to see where you can go with it. So for the mini headline, they went with shaving lives, play on saving lives, but shaving lives. Great. The photo is above, and it says, listening to the buzz from the razor, Mila Moreno gets her head shaved by cosmetology student Samantha Smith. Students were given the opportunity to bid on more than 30 students who volunteered to have their heads shaved for charity. Even though I didn't trust Samantha with an electric razor, it was worth it because I raised a bunch of money for cancer research, Mila said. That meant a lot to me because my grandpa passed away from lung cancer recently. So you can tell in the beginning that there is some environmental information given to you, listening to the buzz from the razor. You're identifying who's in the photo, Mila and Samantha. You have their grade levels, their superscripts, and they're consistent. You can say that Samantha is also a cosmetology student, adding additional context as to how and why she's qualified to shave heads. And it says what's happening. She's getting her head shaved. Yes, it's obvious in the photo, but this is the context that people need to be able to understand why that's happening. Then some background. They were given the opportunity to bid on more than 30 students. They volunteered. She didn't lose a bet. She didn't, she's not just unlucky. She's not a cancer patient. Like, you're giving them that context that you can't tell from just looking at the photo. And then you have her great quote at the end. Another thing to point out, I mentioned it earlier, but is the tense. So the first sentence is in present tense. Listening to the buzz from the razor, she gets her head shaved by cosmetology student. Then you switch to past tense because you're giving that background information about an event that already happened. So students were given the opportunity to bid. They volunteered, past tense, to have their head shaved for charity. It's really important that that first sentence is present tense and then everything after is past tense. So lastly, I have a little bonus for you, some additional ideas for the caption headline, just because I think it's fun to think of, but I also want to get you in the mindset of thinking of more than just one. So we went with shaving lives, but the other options you could use are things like close shave, hair raising experience, clipping for cancer, sheer madness, hair today, gone tomorrow, a hairy situation, new do, win for a trim, a cut above, the main event, good hair, bad hair day. So many options, and you don't want to just let your creativity stop at the first one you think of, because usually your best idea isn't going to be your first idea. So I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions as you guys are writing captions, please let me know. I'm happy to help. Just go to the website, organizedadvisor.com, hit that contact button, that form goes straight to my inbox, and I'll be happy to help you. Until next time, happy caption writing. Bye.